My father told me I wasn't his real daughter to exclude me from my grandmother's will. Only blood relatives deserve the family fortune. I stared at him and asked, "Do you promise to keep your word on that?" Then he said yes. He had a big surprise coming. My grandmother's funeral was as she would have wanted. Discreet, elegant, and filled with white flowers. We were all gathered at the family home. That Victorian mansion that always seemed like something out of a storybook. Although lately it only reminded me of all the debts that were drowning me. While relatives conversed in small groups, I observed my grandmother's portrait over the fireplace. She was the only person who truly understood me in this family of pompous surnames and fake smiles. "You'll always have a place here, dear," she would tell me every time I visited, holding my hand in hers. "When I'm gone, I'll make sure you're taken care of." Those words echoed in my mind as I watched my father talking to the family lawyer, Mr. Torres, in a corner of the room. Their glances in my direction did not bode well. "I need to talk to you in private," my father said after the last guest left. His tone was the same one he used when he had to give me life lessons, which usually meant denying me financial help for some contrived moral reason. He led me to his office, that forbidden sanctuary of my childhood where important decisions were always made. "Your grandmother left a considerable sum, approximately 2,500,000 pesos in addition to the house," he began without preamble or condolences. "But there's a problem with the will." Here it came. Despite my 29 years, he still treated me like a child incapable of managing her own life. I knew he would try to control every penny. "What problem?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the headache that was tormenting me. For weeks, I had been rubbing my temples while speaking. These episodes were getting worse. Last week I passed out at work twice. My boss wasn't understanding. That pain requires a 30,000 peso operation that my health insurance refuses to cover because it's experimental, even though 3 neurologists have recommended the procedure, I added bitterly. "I've been talking to Torres. There are ways to reinterpret your grandmother's intentions." His gaze hardened. "She wanted to protect the family legacy. If Grandma specifically mentioned me in her will, there's nothing to reinterpret," I said, recalling the little I knew about inheritance law from a university course. He smiled with that condescending expression I hated so much. "The will isn't formalized yet. Torres and I have been reviewing some technical details. Your grandmother had moments of confusion in her last months. We could question her mental capacity when she signed it." I felt as if I had been slapped. "Are you saying you're going to contest your own mother's will? Question her sanity? It won't be necessary to go that far if you cooperate. Look, there's something you should know. Something your mother and I decided not to tell you." He paused dramatically. "You're not my biological daughter. Your mother had you with another man before she met me." The world stopped. Of all the lies I expected to hear, this one wasn't on my list. "That's impossible. I have pictures with Mom pregnant by your side. Manipulated photographs. Out of respect for your mother, I maintained this charade. But now, with so much money at stake, I can't allow someone without family blood to claim what belongs to the true descendants." My mind raced. 6 months ago, looking for my birth certificate to renew my passport, I accidentally found some old documents in the attic, adoption papers. But they weren't mine. They were his. My father, Richard, had been adopted at age 2 by my grandparents after losing his biological parents in an accident. The documents were yellowed and partially damaged by moisture in one corner. Some parts were difficult to read, but the official seals and main signatures were still visible, confirming the legal adoption in 1969. There were handwritten notes in the margins that I couldn't fully decipher. "You want to exclude me from the inheritance because I'm not blood related?" I asked, trying to process his lie while pretending to believe him. "Only blood relatives deserve the family fortune," he declared with a conviction I found almost admirable for its irony. "I've already spoken with Torres. He'll have you sign a waiver to your share, for the benefit of your cousins and me." He handed me a document. His signature was already there, waiting for mine like a sentence. "I need time to process this," I managed to say. "You have until the official reading of the will, 3 days. His tone allowed no argument. "It's the right thing to do, Diana. You're not a real Mercer." When I left his office, the walls seemed to close in around me. My mind buzzed with questions. Did my father know he was adopted himself? Or was this a cruel twist of fate? That night, I reviewed the documents I had hidden in my apartment. There was no doubt. My father had been adopted, which meant his argument about family blood was completely hypocritical. I remembered Mrs. Peterson's occasional comments, the 92-year-old neighbor. You look so much like your grandmother when she was young. Not like your father. He always looked more like your grandfather, despite not being his. And she would always stop there, as if remembering she shouldn't say more. My grandmother never made distinctions. She loved my father as her own son, just as he claimed to have loved me all my life. The difference was that she never used that information as a weapon. I cried myself to sleep. Not for myself, but for the man who thought he could build his identity by rejecting others, unaware that he himself was living a lie. The next morning I made a decision. I called an independent lawyer, Dr. Martinez, recommended by a friend. I told her everything, including my father's threat to contest the will by questioning my grandmother's mental capacity, and showed her the adoption documents I had found. She frowned upon hearing about my father's strategy. First, what he's suggesting is extremely difficult to prove, especially if the will was drafted by a lawyer who presumably verified your grandmother's capacity. Second, even if you weren't her biological daughter, which you are, that wouldn't have legal relevance. Anyone can leave their belongings to whomever they wish, family or not. Then why is Mr. Torres helping him with this? Torres was your father's personal lawyer long before he was your grandmother's, yes? Decades. They're golf buddies. There you have it. Clear conflict of interest. We could challenge him on that. In fact, she examined the adoption documents. This is very interesting, but legally irrelevant to your inheritance. It is, however, a powerful bargaining chip, if your father insists on this ethically questionable path. What should I do? Don't sign anything. I can send a formal letter indicating that we have concerns about the handling of the will, and requesting a certified copy of the original. That should cool his plans. The blood relative thing is a baseless legal argument. It's pure intimidation. For the next 2 days, I dedicated myself to gathering more evidence. I needed to be absolutely sure before doing something that would change our lives forever. I visited Mrs. Peterson under the pretext of bringing her homemade cookies as thanks for her presence at the funeral. She lives in an assisted living facility now, but her mind is still surprisingly lucid for her 92 years, although sometimes she confuses the years and calls the nurses by the wrong names. Your grandmother was a great woman, she told me as a nurse served us tea. Her hands trembled too much to do it herself. When she brought, wait, what was your father's name? Richard. I reminded her. Ah yes, Richard. When she brought Richard home, the whole neighborhood was whispering. You know how people are. She leaned in as if to share a secret, although she spoke at the same volume. Mary Donovan, who lived in the Blue House, now it's a Thai restaurant, I think, said it was scandalous, adopting like that without formally announcing it. So, my father joined the family when he was little? I asked, feigning surprise. Oh yes, of course. He was, I don't remember exactly, 2, 3 years old. A precious boy. But quiet, very quiet. She frowned, trying to remember. Your grandfather wasn't convinced at first. He wanted a baby, I think. They had lost one recently, very sad. She took a sip of tea and then abruptly changed the subject to talk about her problems with Medicare. It took another 20 minutes to steer the conversation back. Each word confirmed what I already knew, but also added weight to my moral dilemma. My father genuinely might not know he was adopted. The family secret was deeper than I imagined. That afternoon my Aunt Eleanor called me. At 74, she was my grandmother's younger sister, and the only one who always seemed uncomfortable when my father talked about family traditions and Mercer blood. Your grandmother wanted to talk to you before she died, she said, her voice trembling. About Richard. About him being adopted? I asked directly. The silence on the other end of the line confirmed my suspicions. You know, she whispered finally, I found the documents. Now he's trying to exclude me from the inheritance because supposedly I'm not his biological daughter. Typical Richard, she sighed. Always so obsessed with purity. If he only knew. He doesn't know? Your grandmother and grandfather decided to never tell him. They thought he'd be happier believing he was a Mercer by birth. But your grandmother lately felt remorse. She thought he had the right to know his origins. And now he's doing this to me. Your father has always been afraid of not belonging. It's his way of clinging to an identity he believes is real. She paused. I have something for you. Your grandmother gave me a letter before she died. She said to use it if Richard ever tried anything unjust with you. I met with her that same afternoon. The letter was in a sealed envelope with the family emblem. My grandmother's elegant handwriting marking my name on the front. Dear Diana, it began. If you're reading this, it's because I'm gone, and something has gone wrong with the will. I always knew your father might have difficulty accepting my decisions. Richard was a gift to us, but his insecurity has always been his greatest enemy. We never wanted to tell him about his adoption for fear of hurting him, but now I wonder if that silence was a mistake. True family is not about blood, but about unconditional love. You understand that better than him. Half of my fortune is yours by right, not only because I love you but because you are the true guardian of Mercer values. Use this money wisely and if possible, help your father understand what it truly means to be family. With all my love, Grandma. Tears blurred my vision as I folded the letter. My aunt hugged me. You'll come to the reading of the will, won't you? I asked. I wouldn't miss it for the world. Someone has to be there when the truth comes out. The following day my father called me, furious. You hired a lawyer? Are you serious, Diana? You hired yours, I replied calmly. Or rather, you convinced Grandma's lawyer to help you manipulate her will. Torres is protecting family interests. You're creating an unnecessary spectacle. You're going to go through with this? Contest Grandma's capacity. There was a silence. You know she wasn't completely lucid at the end. We all saw it. She signed that will 2 years ago, Dad, long before she got worse. And if you want to talk about spectacles, how about lying about me not being your biological daughter? Only blood relatives deserve the family fortune. He repeated it like a learned mantra. Are you absolutely sure about that? My lawyer says that legally that has no basis. Anyone can inherit, whether family or not. It's not about laws, it's about principles, he insisted. It's what the Mercers have always done. And he would uphold that principle regardless of the consequences. Don't try to manipulate me, Diana. You don't know who you're dealing with. I'll see you tomorrow at the reading of the will, I concluded with a calmness I didn't feel. That night I didn't sleep. I went over all the possibilities, all the scenarios. Was it fair to reveal a secret my grandparents had kept for decades? Did my father deserve this blow to his identity? But then I remembered my university debts, the surgery I needed, and how he never hesitated to use a lie to leave me with nothing. True family isn't about blood, my grandmother had written, and she was right. My father had forgotten that fundamental lesson. The next morning I dressed carefully. A sober black suit, the pearl necklace my grandmother gave me at my graduation, and the adoption documents in an elegant envelope. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw the reflection of the woman my grandmother always believed I could be. Strong, dignified, just. This isn't revenge, I told myself. It's justice. Mr. Torres's office was exactly as I imagined it. Dark wood, law books, and that air of antiquity that tries to convey confidence. Family members arrived one by one. My Aunt Eleanor greeted me with a discreet hug. My cousins, who had always treated me with a certain condescension, gave me looks of false pity. My father entered last, as if wanting to make an entrance. He stared at me, expecting to see the waiver document in my hands. I held his gaze without blinking. Well, since we're all here, Mr. Torres began, visibly uncomfortable with the presence of Dr. Martinez by my side. We'll proceed with the reading of Mrs. Eleanor Catherine Mercer's will. The lawyer began to read the legal formalities while I observed my father. He shifted impatiently in his seat, occasionally whispering something to his younger brother, my Uncle Peter, who nodded with a serious expression. The main residence on Maple Avenue is left to my son, Richard Alexander Mercer, Torres read. My father nodded as if it were the least he deserved. Of my financial estate, valued at approximately $2,500,000, 50% will be for my granddaughter, Diana Elizabeth Mercer. This is unacceptable. My father interrupted, standing up. There is relevant information that could invalidate these provisions. Torres seemed nervous. Dr. Martinez whispered to me, just as we expected. What information would that be, Mr. Mercer? Torres asked, although he clearly already knew. Diana is not my biological daughter, he announced in a firm voice, looking around the room to gauge the reactions. She does not share Mercer blood. My mother was not in optimal mental condition when she signed this will and evidently did not contemplate this crucial. Dr. Martinez stood up. Excuse me, Mr. Torres, but as legal representative of Miss Diana Mercer, I must point out that these accusations are irrelevant to the validity of the will. Mrs. Eleanor Mercer was in full use of her faculties when she signed it, as you yourself certified. Moreover, biological affiliation has no legal relevance for the designation of heirs. My father glared at her. Who are you, and what are you doing here? Caroline Martinez, attorney specializing in inheritance law. I'm here because my client was informed of a possible attempt to manipulate the will. Torres cleared his throat. Mr. Mercer has the right to express his concerns. Concerns without legal basis, Dr. Martinez interrupted. And I am seriously concerned about the conflict of interest present here, considering your long professional relationship with Mr. Mercer before representing the deceased. A murmur went through the room. My cousins exchanged glances, some with surprise, others clearly uncomfortable. This is ridiculous. My father roared. Diana is not a real Mercer. Only blood relatives deserve the family fortune. It's a basic principle. I stood up slowly, feeling all eyes on me. I wasn't going to argue about my parentage. That was exactly what he wanted. Are you absolutely sure about that principle, Dad? I asked calmly. Of course. Blood is what defines a family. That's what my mother always believed. And you promised to keep your word? That only blood relatives deserve the family fortune. Without a doubt. He declared triumphantly, thinking he had gained some advantage. Mr. Torres, I said, turning to the lawyer, I have documents that might be relevant to this discussion about family blood. I handed him the envelope. Torres opened it and examined the documents. His expression changed subtly as he read. These appear to be adoption documents, he said finally. Adoption? My father frowned. What are you talking about? They are your adoption documents, I said softly. Grandma and Grandpa adopted you when you were 2. After you lost your biological parents in an accident. The color drained from my father's face. That's impossible. It's a forgery. The documents appear authentic, Torres intervened. They have the official seals and corresponding signatures. It's a lie. My father insisted, but his voice had lost conviction. Mrs. Peterson remembers when you arrived at the house, I said. And Aunt Eleanor was there too. All eyes turned to my aunt, who nodded slowly. It was a secret your parents decided to keep, she confirmed. They loved you so much they thought it would be better for you not to know. You knew. My father asked her. His voice barely recognizable. Everyone knew except you. Just the older ones, my aunt replied. Your mother, my sister, loved you as if you were born from her. She never made distinctions. To her, you were her son, period. My father collapsed into his chair, his world crumbling before his eyes. Then, I said softly, according to your own principle, you shouldn't receive anything either. You are not a Mercer by blood. The silence that followed was thick, almost tangible. I could see the internal struggle in my father's eyes. The denial, the anger, and finally the beginning of understanding. Why didn't they tell me? He murmured. For the same reason you wanted to deny me my inheritance, I replied. Fear that you would be treated differently. But Grandma never made that distinction. For her, family was much more than blood. Mr. Torres cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the family drama. If I may, there's something else in the will that might be relevant at this time. We all turned our attention to him. Mrs. Mercer left them. It appears to be a personal message in case of disputes. Mr. Torres cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable with the family drama. He searched through his papers, checked one folder, then another. Excuse me, it seems I don't have it here. Ah, here it is. He pulled out a simple envelope, not the elegant letterhead the family used. The words were handwritten, not typed like the rest of the will. "My dears," it read, adjusting his glasses. "If you are hearing this, it means some disagreement has arisen." He paused to take a sip of water. I noticed his hands were shaking slightly. The atmosphere in the room was so tense you could cut it with a knife. "Let me be clear," he continued. "Richard, we chose you when you were barely a child. Never. Torres squinted at the handwriting. "Excuse me, Mrs. Mercer's handwriting gets a little irregular here. It seems she wrote this during her illness." My father shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Grandma had suffered from Parkinson's in her final years. "You were never less ours," Torres continued. "Diana is your daughter, as you were our son. Family?" He paused again, running his finger over a smudge on the paper. "It seems she spilled something here. In essence, it says that family is defined by love, not genetics." When Torres finished reading, I saw tears in my aunt's eyes. My cousin stared at the floor ashamed. And my father seemed smaller than I had ever seen him, as if his whole life had been built on a lie that was now crumbling. "The reading of the will stands as planned," Mr. Torres concluded, "unless there are further objections." No one spoke. As I gathered my things to leave, I felt my father's hand on my arm. "You knew for a long time?" he asked, his voice broken. 6 months. I found the documents looking for my birth certificate. "Why didn't you tell me?" "It wasn't my secret to reveal. I didn't want to hurt you. Until you tried to take away what Grandma wanted for me." He nodded slowly, but his gaze was lost. He ran a hand through his graying hair several times, a nervous gesture I had seen him do since childhood when something was beyond his control. "I'm leaving," he said abruptly, picking up his briefcase. I need time." He left the office without looking back. My Aunt Eleanor squeezed my hand in support. 3 days later, I received a text message. "The surgery you need, how much was it?" I replied curtly. 30,000. "The insurance says it's experimental." He didn't reply until the next morning. "I'll talk to my friend at Memorial. I think I could help you get a better price. Not because of the money, but because those damn insurances are a ripoff." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't reconciliation. It was his way of processing, I suppose. The following week, my father canceled 2 meetings we had arranged to discuss the inheritance details. The lawyer told me he was indisposed, which meant he was drinking, something he did rarely but intensely when his world fell apart. Guilt? Regret? Shock? I didn't know. I only knew that his entire identity had disintegrated in a matter of minutes. And that's not something that gets resolved with an inspirational talk and a hug. The truth had shaken us all, but it had also created new cracks in an already fragmented family. My cousin Jack called me to tell me I was a manipulative bitch for destroying my father. I had to block his number. That night, organizing some documents, I found an old photo where my grandmother was holding my father as a small child. The way she looked at him, I had never noticed that mixture of love and concern. I kept it in my wallet. 3 weeks passed without news from my father, beyond messages about banking procedures and insurance paperwork. The inheritance transfer process was complicated because the bank required some additional forms. Typical. Then one Tuesday, he appeared at my door without calling beforehand. He smelled faintly of whiskey, his eyes were red, and he was holding a worn cardboard box. "I was at a hotel, then stayed with Robert," he said, referring to an old friend I had never liked. "I found this in the attic." He pushed the box towards me. Inside there was a black and white photo album. A young couple with a baby, a newspaper clipping about a car accident, medical documents. "My biological parents," he said hoarsely. "Apparently my father was a mechanic. My mother gave piano lessons." He let out a dry laugh. "Ironic, isn't it? My whole life bragging about the Mercer lineage, and it turns out I come from ordinary people." He sat down on the edge of the sofa as if he were going to run off at any moment. The conversation was awkward, with long silences and unfinished sentences. There was no grand moment of reconciliation. Just 2 wounded people trying to navigate unfamiliar territory. "The bank finally released the funds," I commented, trying to lighten the mood. "I can schedule the surgery now." "Good," he said. He paused. I've been seeing someone, a psychologist. It's ridiculous at my age, but your aunt insisted. It was the closest thing to an apology or explanation I got that day. Grandma's fortune allowed me to pay for the surgery, which was complicated and required a second intervention that no one anticipated, and part of my university debts. I invested the rest as she would have wanted. Before leaving that night, my father stopped in front of my grandmother's portrait, which I have in my living room. She should have told me, he murmured. My whole life was a lie. Not all of it, I replied. She loved you. That wasn't a lie. He shrugged and left without a clear goodbye. He left his umbrella behind, even though it was raining. Many comment on my father's situation. Still complicated. We talk every couple of weeks. Sometimes it's almost normal, other times he's bitter and blames me for stealing his identity. He's seeing a therapist, which is a miracle considering his men don't need help mentality. My cousin still doesn't talk to me. Aunt Eleanor is the only one holding this dysfunctional family together. For those who suggest I should have hidden the truth, maybe they're right. Sometimes I wonder if doing the right thing was worth it. The money in exchange for shattering my father. I don't know. I'm not the flawless heroine of this story. I just did what I thought was necessary at the time.